Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's MDDI webinar, Medical Device Packaging as Told Through Design Control, sponsored by Oliver Healthcare Packaging and broadcast by Informa. This is the second day of presentations in our series, How the MedTech Industry Can Respond to Crisis. If you haven't already, I encourage you to check out this series at the link included in the Resources tab in the presentation window. I'm Daphne Allen, editor of MDDI, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. Today's webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides via the Resources widget. Toward the end of our webinar, we will ask you to complete our survey found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please click the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen, or type your issue into the Q&A area, and we will be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. Now, onto the presentation, Medical Device Packaging as Told Through Design Control. Discussing today's topic, we have Jen Goff, Director of Product Marketing with Oliver Healthcare Packaging. To learn about our speaker, please visit the Speakers widget. Jen, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Can everyone hear me? Hopefully you can, just making sure. Thank you all for taking time out of what I know is very busy schedules and what I hope to be a very informative and valuable presentation. So I'm Jen Goff. I'm Director of Product Marketing with Oliver Healthcare Packaging. I am a grad from Michigan State University with a BS in packaging. And I worked right out of school for Edwards Lifesciences for in many different roles as in packaging, whether it was in operations, R&D, packaging laboratory, or quality. I held responsibilities in all of those roles. And then I moved on to Stryker, where I also did additional packaging as a staff engineer in their instruments division. And then I started leading the packaging team and then gained additional responsibility for their labeling team and their electrical approvals team, which is the team that's responsible for adhering to IEC 60601. Then moved on to a very different role, more commercial facing, more customer facing, in a marketing role within Oliver, and I couldn't be more happy to be here now. So why this presentation, right? Let's see if I can get that forward. Great. Why this presentation? Why is it important? Really, you know, over my years, I would say 15 plus years of experience in the industry, there are some common themes I've found and some common experiences that I've had across multiple of my colleagues throughout the industry. One of them is that packaging tends to get pulled in after the device is mostly designed. Now, depending on what size organization you're with or what how big your packaging team is, this can vary, right? Some organizations are great at getting packaging involved early, and then others definitely have an opportunity for improvement there. And so that's one of the reasons of why to talk through this process today. The other piece is I've heard specifically to me from my R&D partners is, you know, it's packaging, just put it in a pouch, in a box, and you're done. And it just shows the lack of understanding and appreciation and really knowledge about the requirements for packaging and the amount of time it can take to get a packaging verified, validated, and through the process. And then also there's an opportunity to add value to the overall user experiences and in some case create competitive advantages in the marketplace. And I want to talk through some potential opportunities today. And then understanding the impact proposed changes can make. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a situation where a device change was made a month prior, and then all of a sudden I find out about it as I'm going into design verification, and it's a change that impacted the packaging. So therefore, it's either rushing and getting new samples and getting the packaging redesigned, or it's in a stage where the packaging is already in aging and things are ready to go, and now we have to start over. So understanding the impact of those changes is really important throughout the process. So I'm going to start with what are design controls. So design controls are in place to require manufacturers of medical devices to maintain procedures to control the design of the device in order to ensure that specified design requirements are met. In simple terms, design controls are proving through documentation that you did what you said you were going to do. So design controls are there to really help us tell that story. So here's a snapshot of the design control per FDA CFR 21.8.820. Now, this is obviously very specific to FDA. The design control requirements can also be found in EU MDR. They can be found in the CFDA, so China FDA. So whatever regulation you have to adhere to, they all have some form of this, and they're all very similar, but I'm specifically going to be talking to the FDA requirements. So as you can see, it starts with design and development planning. You then get into design input, design output, then you go into design reviews, which actually happen throughout the process, then design verification, design validation, design transfer, and then design changes. So we're going to go through each step of these throughout this presentation. I also wanted to show what I find is a very valuable pictorial of the overall process. So it really begins with user needs. So those user needs are the end user that's using the product, and the whole process begins with what they need. Those user needs are translated into design inputs. You have the design process in between, and then that gives you the design outputs. The design outputs, once that's all created, you have a medical device. As you can see, there's this difference between verification and validation. The verification are verifying that the design output meets what the design inputs were. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then the validation is once you have the final medical device in its final configuration in the packaging, design validation is validating that it met the user needs. And then there's review of this entire process throughout. So we're going to start with design and development planning. So you start with a project plan, right? So typically before this, there's a lot of discovery, there's a lot of research, there are a lot of things that happen to get to the stage of, okay, we have a business case, we need to create a project plan, we know that we have an unmet need in the market, and we need to get the project moving. So it's creating a project plan. A lot of times packaging is not involved in this process because at the end of the day, the person creating the project or leading the project may not even be aware of the impact packaging can have to the overall project. So getting involved this early with just some input as to what it might take or a very high level understanding of what is going to be required for packaging, so how many resources will be necessary and how much the cost will be for packaging development is important in this stage in the game. Also understanding packaging roles and responsibilities. So what are you, the packaging engineer, going to be responsible for? What are you going to be accountable for? What are you expecting to be consulted on? And what are you just expecting to be informed of? Then understanding the scope of the project is really important to your overall design and understanding of how you're going to create and develop this package. So understanding if this is just an iterative, I call it iterative innovation, which is maybe a next gen product. Maybe it's just next generation. So it's kind of the same, but a couple more tweaks that meets a couple more unmet user needs, or is this on the other side of the spectrum, which is disruptive innovation? Is this like a brand new product to the market, never been seen, never been used, and there's a lot going on? This is going to help you understand, is this something where I'm just going to leverage existing packaging, or is this something where I get to maybe create and design a new package platform with maybe new materials or new design features that can really give this product a competitive advantage. And then also understanding the regulatory strategy and the potential impact to the device packaging. So understanding, environmental compliance requirements, the timeline strategy. So is this something that we need to get to market quicker than we've ever gotten any product to market, or is this something that maybe has a little bit of time? I say that jokingly because I've never been part of a project where they say, oh, we have a little bit of time. So I do say that jokingly, but at the same time, understanding the timeline is important. And then is this clinical trials? Are there going to be multiple stages of packaging throughout this process where I may have to create some sort of early on clinical trial packaging and then have some more commercialized packaging at another stage? So this is that design and development portion. Next, we get into design inputs and the user needs. This is my favorite part, if I'm being honest. This is where we get to really understand how is this product and package being used. And there are many ways to get this information. So there's ways such as voice of the customer, so partnering with your marketing or clinical professionals and getting a voice of the customer and understanding how packaging is used. Is packaging going to be part of the procedure? I've seen some really amazing, innovative packaging out there for medical devices where maybe the packaging is labeled with instructions on how to use or when to use each piece within the procedure. Or maybe the packaging is part of the preparation for the procedure. I've seen situations like that as well. And really, really great opportunities. But understanding that VOC and that voice of the customer is really the voice of the end user is really important, because sometimes what's happening with your devices is they're getting the voice from the surgeon or the person performing the clinical event, but the people opening the packaging, their voices aren't always heard. So ensuring that if you're able to get some of that, there's rich information in there. And then looking at customer complaints. So I talked about, next generation devices. When there's a next generation device, that means there's a predicate device, and you can look at complaints. You can understand, is there anything in that data that can make our packaging better, that can get us maybe something that'll just make it more user-friendly. And then there's empathic design. And, this is something that's super exciting. There's a lot of research out there. There's a lot of training out there on empathic design. But this is really, empathic design is unarticulated user needs. So this is when a end user walks through how they're going to use the packaging. They actually are using it in front of you, and they're talking about it as they're doing it. And you're taking kind of an understanding some challenges that they're having without them necessarily saying it. So it's unarticulated. The best example I can think of, and the most common example, is around when people when Ford asked customers what they needed way back in the day, they said they needed faster horses. That unarticulated user need was actually that they just needed to get from point A to B much quicker, and so hence the automobile was created. So that's a great opportunity to get these user needs. So I'm going to walk through actually some specifics and some examples throughout this entire process so that you all can walk away with some knowledge of how do we fill this out. I do want to create the caveat that depending on the organization you are in, this is a large spectrum of how much information gets into the design control document. Because the design control document, what I've seen in multiple instances, there are some where packaging is maybe one line item, and then there are other design control documents where I've seen there's 20 to 30 packaging line items. So really, you have to understand your organization, the requirements. I wouldn't, if you're in one of those organizations that maybe only has one line item today, I wouldn't go in guns a-blazing saying, we need 30 items, we need to talk through this. But it's a journey. It's helping people understand that own these documents, how packaging needs to be part of this story. So here are some examples of design inputs. Device to remain protected through expiration date at point of use. That's an expected. So the source is it's expected. It's a requirement. It's a regulated requirement. Then we get into maybe package to allow ease of aseptic transfer. While this is also expected and also a regulatory requirement, you can also look at VOC and complaints to understand, is there any additional information we need to to consider when we look at the design input. Then, device size needs to be clearly identifiable with other sized devices. That has been identified through empathic design. Package to be stored on a hanging rack. That's where it's used. Maybe we found that out through voice of customer interviews. So with the design inputs comes a requirements document. So I don't expect all of the requirements for what the packaging needs and how to design the packaging would go into the design input or the design control document. That design requirements document is going to include all of the information about the device, about distribution, about sterilization that you need in order to design the appropriate package. So it's going to talk about the geometry of the device, any sharp components, are there any fragile components? Understanding the sterilization method is key. Understanding biocompatibility requirements. What about the distribution plan? Is this being shipped internationally? Is this being shipped only locally? Is it being shipped to distribution centers and then being shipped out separately? Is it being shipped via pallet load, single parcel post? All of those things need to be taken into consideration as you're developing and designing the packaging. Product configuration is a big one, right? Is this a 1-pack? Is this a 5-pack? Maybe it's both, right? So understanding how it's going to be shipped and what the configuration is also important. And then labeling requirements, right? Making sure you understand how big the IFU is if it's going in. Is there an IFU or is there only EIFU? Understanding how big the labeling that's going to be on the primary package is. Are there 20 languages on that label? And ensuring that you design the package appropriately. So one, it protects the device and allows for aseptic transfer, but also can allow for sterilization if the label is a very large label, and how to work through some of those challenges. And this is only a snapshot of some of the things to think about during design requirements, but definitely these are the top priority things to think about, but there are many other as well. Obviously the equipment that you use, the production environment, things like that as well. So some examples here. So when you have a design input, so for instance, device to remain protected through expiration at point of use. When you have the user need, you have the user need, and then what is the design input that goes with that, right? The user need is from the customer, remember, and the design input is what we're going to verify. So we're going to verify that the device is to remain functional post-transportation and storage testing. So that is the design input. If I keep going through this, if we talk about the fact that the device needs to remain sterile through expiration date at point of use, the input is that the package is to generate a sterile barrier around the device for a 3-year shelf life, and that packaging materials must allow for device sterilization by means of ethylene oxide. So that's already been chosen, as part of one of the design inputs ethylene oxide has. If I keep going, packaging to allow ease of aseptic transfer by means of the picking method, the design input we've chose is an HDPE mounting card with device distal end at chevron pouch end. And this came through some complaint information, right? Because initially this was on a mounting card, and we found that the device distal end, the lighter piece part of the device, is where the opening end needed to be, as opposed to the handle being at the opening end. And this was found through some complaints and understanding that we could have designed a little bit better, and some VOC. And then also, identifying the sterile barrier, so a nylon Tyvek pouch with a chevron seal. Then we get into the package to give instructions and organize device components per the procedure requirements. So the design input would be packaged to be printed on an HDPE mounting card with identifiable sequence for procedural usage. And then device size needs to be clearly identifiable with other size devices. So the design input would be package label to have color or coding of compatible size devices used during the procedure. And then lastly, package to be stored on a hanging rack. Pouch to have hang hole for standard OR racking system. as you can imagine, these design inputs can range in very, very, very specific. I could have a lot of numbers in here as far as, pouch tab hang hole for standard OR racking system. I could have the exact size for the hang hole in this design input if I'd like. Or they can also be more, they can be less specific. So, and I want to talk about the fact that you have to really understand your environment and what your project team, what they're used to help get into what are the appropriate design inputs and what is the level of specificity. Let's see if I can try that again. Specificity that you can use for your specific company and what they're used to. Now, I do want to throw caution out there, right? Because there have been many times that I have seen design inputs get too specific. Too specific meaning that they couldn't get verified and validated. They were unable to be verified because they were just too specific, and they didn't have to be that specific to meet the user need. So it wasn't as if that specification came from a user need. It was more, we interpreted the user need to mean that, and therefore we kind of handcuffed ourselves. So I throw caution out there to ensure that, you're determining the specifications versus what's required versus what's nice to have. I also, throw in this piece around risk. So as the design evolves, new risks may become evident, and this is the design control document is a living document. So it is rev controlled. There are justifications for why you change the rev and what changes, but evaluating risk on an ongoing basis is just as important as the information in it being correct. So moving on to design output. So the result of a design effort is really the design output. It's the finished design output that is the basis for the device master record. And this is used for basically all of the information that you need to build the device, right, from start to finish. So design outputs are specifications. They, like the minimum peel force or a critical quality attribute. Maybe they're standards and test results that you have that are associated with those, how to find those specifications or how to gather the data for those specifications. Their internal procedures, their drawings. So I kind of I did put together the design outputs that would be associated with each one of these design inputs and where you would find it. Now, you can get very specific here as far as the specification, but really it's where you're going to find this information. So as far as the device to remain functional post-performance and stability testing, you're going to find that on the package drawing to ensure that, like, the length and the width, the package is the same size that it was that you initially validated. The bill of materials is going to have the packaging materials and what you've used to validate or to verify the packaging. There are packaging specifications that will be used as far as the peel strength. And so really you're using the packaging drawing, labeling artwork, specifications, the bill of materials to really identify where those design outputs are located. Then, so I want to talk about design review because I know it's in this linear process here, but really it is throughout the entire process. So design reviews happen throughout each stage in the process. And these are really, they can be concept reviews, they are validation strategy reviews, and this is typically a person that is not tied to the project, but is an expert in or has a lot of experience with managing these types of projects and getting these products through to market and understanding the regulations and requirements. So typically that person is at a higher level within the organization and they're reviewing from a outsider's point of view and just ensuring that everything, all of the justifications, any sort of root cause evaluations, the sample size rationales, all of that makes sense for for maybe for an auditor or a quality professional to review. So they're just really looking at it from an outside view at each stage within this process to ensure that all of the information makes sense. Then we move into design verification. So design verification, is the method in which you confirm the specified requirements can be consistently fulfilled. So for packaging specifically, you're looking at, you're looking at performance testing, you're looking at stability testing. You have a lot of, which methods did you choose and why? So why did you choose the worst case package configuration that you did? Why did you choose ASTM versus ISTA? What assurance level did you choose and why? There are a lot of, during design verification, there's a lot of information and justification that goes into designing the test method and not designing the test method, but ensuring that you've made the appropriate decisions before getting into actual testing. Why did you choose the 1-pack versus the 5-pack or the 5-pack versus the 1-pack? So just ensuring that all of that information is there and available, that's part of the story. Then we get into design validation. So design validation is a method in which you confirm the design meets the user needs and the intended use. So, this is an area that sometimes packaging isn't able to get as involved in because this is meeting with the end user. And so depending, again, on your organization and what their typical process is, you may have to partner with marketing or clinical or your usability team because of the recent requirements in EU MDR and ISO 11607. This design validation is very important to not only complete, but to understand what you're doing it and why you're doing it. So, partnering with those functions is very important to get the end user's feedback and validate that what you designed, what you developed was intended and it met those user needs. And ensuring that, I find it interesting through my experience, I've had different levels of engagement with my marketing team, with my clinical team, and being able to be in, in one of those kind of, whether it's in a surgical suite or whether it's in a conference room, but watching the end user open that package and give you feedback and answer the questions around, did this meet the original intent, is really invaluable. So if you have those opportunities, I highly recommend you take advantage of them. The other piece too is if you don't have those opportunities today, there is no reason to push yourself into those opportunities. I've done that a couple of times. I've seen how I've watched other end packaging engineers do that with success. And it's really all about building those relationships with the people that are responsible for meeting with those end users and making sure they trust and feel comfortable putting you in front of a customer ultimately. And if you can build that rapport and build that relationship, they are going to have open arms and allow you to be part of that conversation. Obviously, there are a lot of different things that play into this, right? So if you are going into an OR or a cath lab, there are a lot of requirements that you must have as far as, shots and all sorts of different things, documentation that you have to fill out. So depending on that, you might not be able to be involved. But again, I was of the impression that I'm going to do whatever it takes to get me in front of a customer because those experiences are really invaluable. So this is kind of the entire story with design control here. We start with user needs. We cite the source of where it's from. We talk about design input. What is the design input? How have we translated the user need into a design input? Then what is the design output? Where do we find that information? And then how are we verifying and validating it? And where can we find that information? This is really a very high level snapshot of where to go for all of this information, where to go for the specifications, where to go for the verification and validation documentation. And it's really nice to have this for every product and every product family because during an audit situation, it's all right here. It's not digging and looking for information and not being able to find it and it being all over the place. It's all in one location for that specific product. So then you get into design transfer. So design transfer is really about transferring the product to manufacturing. So each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures to ensure that the device design is correctly translated into production specifications. This is key, right? This is key in understanding this process even when you're at the very beginning, right? Because if you have a tray sealer and you don't have a pouch sealer, then you're going to need to either get operations to procure a pouch sealer, or you're going to have to put that into the design input that it needs to be a thermoform tray and a lid as opposed to a pouch, and figure out how you can work through that process. And really weigh, can you work through that process, or do you have to create a business case of why you need a pouch sealer? And vice versa, right? To be honest, majority of the time, it's vice versa. It's you have pouch sealers, but yet your user need is saying that they want it in a tray, and the operations team is saying, we don't, that's not something that's in our budget. We can't afford to purchase that piece of equipment. Not to mention it's going to include lengthening the timeline. There are a lot of discussions that happen with regard to design transfer. But knowing about design transfer and the fact that you have to do this at the end is important in the upfront work as well. So the other piece is once you're transferring the design into the manufacturing environment, creating a procedure for how to package the device in a bubble is probably one of the riskiest things you can do, because once you get it into manufacturing and you get it approved and they start using it and say they don't package the product per the procedure, they don't understand the procedure, that is just a snowball effect of nonconformances and updating documents, and it's just a invaluable use of your time. So what I really recommend is understanding how to create a good procedure for your operators. And really that is putting the package in front of them and watching how they package it. How do they put it together? And watching that first and understanding, one, is that acceptable? Or two, helping understand how maybe you could even improve the packaging for operations. But really making sure that you watch how they do it so that that is part of your procedure. Ensuring that the configuration is in the operations procedure. Ensuring that there are photos that are clear, that operators can understand, that there are clear instructions, step-by-step instructions, and then making sure that they are part of the process. It's such a valuable experience and really, really prevents any sort of, I would say, any sort of wasted time down the road. And then obviously there's also the in-process specifications and monitoring. So through your risk evaluation, identifying what is the appropriate sample size. Are we running pouches or trays at the beginning of each work order and at the end of each work order? Are they at the beginning of the day and at the end of each day? And then are we doing some in-process monitoring to ensure how are we not, because we are going to be doing in-process monitoring for a sterile barrier seal. But how does that process look, or what does that process look like? And how do we ensure that that is part of the discussion with our operations team? So the other big piece here is design changes. So when we get into design changes, they have to be documented, they have to be evaluated. And so the requirement here is that each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures for the identification, the documentation, the validation, or where appropriate verification, the review and approval of design changes before implementation. So what that means is throughout the process, there are many potentials for design changes. We learn more as we continue through the process. So the device may have some small changes or some small tweaks. And a lot of times, maybe that doesn't impact the packaging. But I have also been part of many situations where a small change to the design of the device is a big change to the design of the packaging. And so ensuring you are, again, kind of strong-arming your way into those conversations to ensure that you're aware of what is changing, when is it changing, or at least having a review every week or 2 weeks around have any changes happened, what are they, because that is going to prevent any major issues during, launch. It's going to prevent any major issues to the timeline and any cost or resources. Because ultimately, all of these changes have to be documented, and packaging is part of the evaluation of a lot of those changes. Again, I've been part of situations where a device had changed. There was a small change to the device, but it actually changed a strap on a card, on a HDPE card, and that change, I had already validated the entire packaging system. Or verified, shouldn't say validated, I verified the entire packaging system. So it had gone through design verification, it had gone through aging. And so then you're scrambling at the end of, is this a major change? Is this not a major change? Can I justify this, or do I have to redo packaging design verification? There have been instances where a change has happened so late in the game that you actually have to redo design verification, which then extends the timeline, 3 months, 1 month, 2 months, whatever it takes. And, it doesn't feel good to have those conversations with the project leader and really the leaders within the organization. It just doesn't feel good to be the reason that we're slipping the timeline, even though obviously that's not the root cause, but at the same time, packaging is the reason for the delay. So understanding those changes, understanding how they impact the packaging is very important throughout the overall process. The last piece I'm going to get into before we open it up for questions here in a few is risk and sample size. So these are two very common questions in our industry that have many debates about. There is no one size fits all. It is so dependent on the organization, on the device itself, on the amount of risk an organization itself takes versus maybe I would consider a startup being a much more risky organization than, say, a huge global conglomerate medical device company. And so, startups might be more risky because they need to move fast. They need to get their products to market quickly. They have innovation that they're trying to work on. And again, large companies are doing that, but large companies have a lot more at stake if they mess that up, right? So risk is very important to understand. What is the culture within your organization? What are the norms that are set? And really the considerations for risk specifically are, severity and occurrence rate. And severity can really depend on the classification of the device. Is it a class 1, class 2, class 3 device? Is it, an implant versus a disposable? One experience I had and one example that I like to share is that with, a class 3 implantable device that has never been on the marketplace, I'm talking about a transcatheter heart valve. I was part of a project that brought that product to market. And the severity was very different than I would say when I worked at Stryker for more of a disposable product that was used during surgical procedures that was very repeatable and, that we used a lot. And I'll explain the difference. So with the transcatheter heart valve, this was new to market, never been used before. It was being used in clinical trials. And the first sample set, the first patient population were severely critically ill patients, right? So either they could get the procedure and potentially it works, or their other option was to potentially not get the procedure and the inevitable outcome was death, unfortunately. With those critically ill patients, we know that they cannot withstand an infection and the chances of them living through that would be very low. So the criticality of a device breach or a package breach in sterile barrier and them getting an infection was very, very different than a very healthy athlete who was getting a knee implant, right? So we have to think about the severity for what that patient population looks like with regard to packaging and ensure that if it's critically ill patients that are getting these procedures, the severity for package breach is going to be very different versus healthy population, getting, you know, a routine procedure that really potentially the most probable worst case is them getting an infection. Obviously, there are fault trees that you can use to understand what potentially, you know, how likely it would be to lead to death in those situations. But I digress. That's important with the severity. And then you look at occurrence rate. So occurrence rate, you know, is really understanding the clinical expertise, looking at your risk management file and how they've already set that up. Marketing and sales input can help with occurrence rate for how often these types of things occur. But being part of those risk discussions are very important to the overall your learning and also understanding of where your organization lies with regard to risk. And then if we get into sample size, that's directly related to risk. So whatever we determine risk is for our specific device, for our specific product, that is going to correlate to the sample size necessary through, you know, repeatability and reproducibility. So ensuring you understand that risk is that baseline, and then you can go to sample size from there. So lastly, what are the takeaways, right? So the first piece is get involved with your project teams early. Push instead of pull. Don't let them pull you, you know, don't wait for them to pull you in. Just start asking questions, following up. That's, you know, in my experience, how I've been successful and also how team members that I've led have been successful. So get involved early and really try to help educate. The next piece is provide input, design, review, control, documentation. So educate your cross-functional teams. They don't know what they don't know. So if you know that packaging is going to take 6 months or 18 months to get the equipment in, validated, the package, the design verification completed, and like educate them on that. Help them understand what it's going to take. I've been really successful for personally, and then also my teams have been successful in creating just a packaging 101 document or presentation, and either sending it to the project team or offering to give a quick half-hour or hour presentation in a lunch and learn or whatever it may be to say, hey, this is what we do in packaging, and this is why this is where we can add value to the overall project and the overall timeline. Third, get inspired. There are so many, for any of you that know me, I do know that there are a few people on the line that know me. You know that I am very inspired by packaging, and as you know, as silly as it may be to some, I am inspired by it. I'm the type of person that goes into a grocery store or a Target, and when I'm seeing these new innovative consumer packages or food packages, I think about how can these relate to our industry? How are these packages that might have opportunity to build in better design features within our industry? Team building activities. You know, one of the things is taking your project team to a Target and saying, hey, everyone break up into teams. We're all going to go try to find the most innovative package, and we're going to bring it back to the table and, you know, discuss, unpackage it. We're going to talk about it. And it will help people relate more to what packaging is and that end user. Of course, it does not relate to the specific aseptic transfer in that specific situation, but there might be features that you can find within packaging on a Target or grocery store shelf that I start identifying with and saying, hey, what if we could do this, or could we do this or that, or this could lead to a competitive advantage. There are lots of articles out there in the industry to help you get inspired. We at Oliver have a blog that is, I would say, best in class. I really do say that without my Oliver hat on because it is a great place to learn and understand what's going on in the industry. Looking at other industries and what they're doing specifically around sustainability and what organizations are helping drive sustainability, and, you know, how can we get more sustainability into more sustainable materials into this industry, because it's coming. And then lastly, just don't forget to tell the story, right? It's all about the story. And if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So it's telling the story through documentation about the fact that what we said we were going to do is what we did, and we're proving it here for your review. So with that, thank you so much. I am going to hand it back over to Daphne, and we're going to open it up for some questions.
Thank you, Jen, so much. Great information. Really appreciate that. So before we begin with today's Q&A, I want to direct our audience's attention to our webinar survey. It's available on the right of the slides window. If you close the survey, you can open the widget by clicking the icon along the bottom of your screen. Thank you in advance for filling out the feedback form. Your participation in this survey allows us to serve you better. And now, on to our Q&A. As a reminder, to participate, just type your question into the text box located to the right of the slides window, or click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If we are not able to answer all submitted questions during today's webinar, we'll be sure to share them with Jen, who can reply to you offline. So Jen, to begin, in your experience, what have been the biggest roadblocks encountered during the design control and package development process?
I think the biggest roadblocks are sometimes we as packaging engineers know we know what needs to be done, but articulating it in a way that relates to our project leaders or our R&D engineers on the team is sometimes challenging. So getting a feel for what the design document looks like today, or what previous design documents, design control documents look like prior, it helps us understand how we even show up and how we come to the table with filling those out. But really, I kind of talk about the biggest roadblock is even getting involved, getting invited to the table, right? Getting invited to give this input as opposed to somebody else just doing it for you because they don't want to add more people to the meeting. And I think that that's the biggest roadblock, and there are lots and lots of ways to overcome that. But the biggest is just to ask or to just show up.
Okay, thank you. You referenced 21 CFR Part 820. Do you have any comment on alignment with ISO 13485 or additional effects or impacts to packaging anticipated once or when FDA formally adopts ISO 13485?
Oh, that is a great question, and I have not been up to speed on 13485 and the changes that are happening there. But I really appreciate that question, and I'm actually taking a note right now to go look into that. But no, I don't have an answer to that question. I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. All right, so our next question. What are some reasons to choose ISTA versus ASTM test standards? Are they equivalent in validating a packaging system? Are both acceptable outside the U.S.?
Yeah, so great question. Yes, so you're racking my memory here. So at one point, ASTM was the only, people used ASTM and ISTA, but ASTM was recognized on the FDA's list of consensus standards. Since then, that has changed where ISTA is also listed. And so really, what I've noticed, it's of organizational preference. I am personally very comfortable with ASTM. I use ASTM often only because I grew up in the industry that way, and I'm very comfortable with those methods, and I was part of those committees. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the most important thing is to understand your distribution cycle, your distribution environment. And whatever your distribution environment is, and the standard that best relates to that is what I highly recommend you using. Like I said, I've been very comfortable and confident using ASTM internationally, globally. I think from my understanding and from what I've heard, ISTA is it's absolutely allowed from FDA perspective. It is listed in our ISO 11607 document, which is an international standard. So from an international acceptance, I don't see a reason why it wouldn't be easy to talk through that in an audit or with a regulatory agency. But I haven't had this specific experience of using ISTA, and I haven't really heard any challenges as of lately with using ISTA, other than just, again, most important, understand your distribution environment and what standard do you feel really encompasses that environment and can best represent it.
Okay, excellent. Next question. What is the difference between verification and validation?
All right, so there's going to be two parts to this. So there is design verification and design validation, right? And then there is process validation. So I'm going to split it into ISO 11607 Part 1 and ISO 11607 Part 2. So ISO 11607 Part 1 is all about design verification. That is your performance testing and your stability testing, so aging and distribution. And then they talk about design validation, which is the whole piece around the validating that the user needs, basically validating the user needs. So can the end user aseptically transfer the device? Can the end user aseptically transfer the device by means of a pick method? Can the end user read the labeling? Those are some design validation questions, very, very straightforward. Then if you get into ISO 11607 Part 2, you're talking about process validation. So process validation is all about the sealing process and ensuring that the inputs of the sealing process, so maybe it's time, temperature, and pressure, that those can be validated repeatably and reproducibly over time, over multiple startups and shutdowns, and that you feel confident and you've validated that process. So I hope I answer that question, but it is a very, very common, and you heard me throughout the presentation mix it up actually. It's very common for it to get mixed up, but I think understanding that with ISO 11607 Part 1, you have design verification and you have design validation. With ISO 11607 Part 2, you have process validation. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. What technology do you find most useful to enable the design control process from your past experiences?
Excel. Again, I say that jokingly because I feel like that question, maybe you have some better ideas than me, but I've only ever experienced it through Excel. There are some, I knew there were some recent technology and platforms that were being created where you can do it through almost like, so that there are systems, I believe at one of the companies I worked at, they used a software system that from the product, whatever that product is, that product had all of the information included in it, but the design control information was still in an Excel spreadsheet, but it was just attached, like the bill of material, everything was attached to that product, like the design verification documentation, the process validation documentation, all of the documentation was included in that system. But with regard to design control itself, I think we used a DIOBV, which is design input, output, verification, and validation. That's what we called it, but I think they call it different things at different places. But it's always been Excel. That's what I've used. But if you have better ideas, please share.
Okay, great. Do you recommend use of cold chain packaging for international use of clinical trial packaging? And how about the use of CR packaging at this early stage?
So for cold chain, I think it just depends on what your user needs are. So if it requires cold chain, then absolutely. I mean, if the device is sensitive to certain temperatures and will then therefore be, it would impact the clinical trials or the data, then absolutely, there's no question. I think I hope I'm interpreting the question correctly. But yes, I do recommend cold chain in those specific situations. Now, if you're talking about a standard device that doesn't have those types of design inputs where temperature is not a sensitivity, then no, I wouldn't recommend that. I guess I would allow the design inputs to lead me there.
Okay. And then CR packaging, would that be the same?
I don't know the acronym.
Okay.
CR. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure. No, I'm not sure either. I mean, maybe child resistant, but I'm not sure. So, okay. All right. So next question, based on your experience or the current industry's interpretation of ISO 11607 Part 1, does the design verification testing of the aging for the sterile barrier system samples will require the samples to be preconditioned for transport simulation?
In my experience, and through many conversations in the industry, those are separate entities. So preconditioning and performance testing, so distribution simulation, is separate than an aging test or a stability test. So those would be separate in my experience and through many conversations throughout the industry with leaders in the industry. And you can reference ISO. There is a portion in ISO 11607 that helps have that conversation with a regulatory agency or an auditor as well. I don't have it off of the top of my head, but I mean, I believe you all will have my email, or you know, you can look me up on LinkedIn and I can help you with that.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. What is the difference between design validation and a usability study?
That's a great question. So that is very specific to the organization in which you work. I have seen a large range of how design validation is, how that requirement is fulfilled. So some organizations, typically smaller, do not have a usability team. Do very vaguely follow the usability requirements, and they're able to justify that appropriately. And really, it's design validation is done by means of a survey, right? It's a survey that I kind of simplified it earlier, that said, can you transfer this aseptically, yes or no? Where some organizations that do have usability teams are able to follow the standards for usability, and they take that design validation portion on within their function. So, you know, when I talked about responsible, accountable, informed, and when the C. So when I talked about, you know, what your responsibilities are within your project, some organizations for design validation, whether it's packaging or device, that will go into usability's function, and they are required to do that. Whereas, again, if the company doesn't have a usability function, then packaging is required to do the design validation. Now, I've also seen products get through with the very simplistic survey for design validation, and I've seen products get through with the very complex usability studies that are done. So I've seen kind of the full spectrum. It really depends on the organization you're within.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are almost out of time for our broadcast today. We do have some audience questions that are still left. So Oliver Healthcare Packaging will be following up offline. So we sincerely thank our audience for the great participation today on the questions. Thank you to our sponsor, Oliver Healthcare Packaging, as well as to everyone who attended, and especially thank Jen for your wonderful presentation today.
Thank you.
To our audience, you're very welcome. Within the next 24 hours, our audience will be receiving a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been available today. This webinar is copyright 2020 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned or copyrighted by Informa Markets. Our speaker, Jen Goff, is solely responsible for her content and opinions. I'm Daphne Allen. Thank you for your time and have a great day.